on Grizzly Talk, tough talk for challenging topics. And I have a guest today, JP. JP is here joining us to discuss, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell you a little bit about what you do.
Okay. Yeah, my name's JP Frank, and I live here in Missoula. I actually grew up in Missoula, pretty much my whole family. Yeah, my entire family is actually in Montana, but spent a long chunk of time away from Missoula and moved back a couple years ago. And I am someone who cares a lot about building a sense of community for myself and for others, and specifically do that in ways that really acknowledge our bodies and self-expression and the ways that maybe we've been like isolated or lonely, and trying to create spaces that really create a sense of togetherness and can welcome lots of different kinds of people, and then also do work with individuals in the community. And could say a lot more about how I do that work, but that's essentially what drives my work, is trying to create a sense of community for myself and others.
I'm trying to avoid from, like, how do you describe it? Because I keep wanting to say therapy because that's what I do with like somatic work in my line of work. So it's group work for empowerment, self-improvement. How do you describe it for people?
So I do a lot of different things, but I'd say the through line of the community spaces that I hold is it's places where I welcome people to. So I think what happens is when people are feeling like shy or like insecure or maybe sad or angry or irritable, like they don't always feel comfortable actually showing up in community, because maybe they're worried like people are gonna be like concerned if I show up that way, or they're gonna be uncomfortable, or how am I gonna be perceived? And so they tend to show up in community like when maybe they feel better or they can put on like a happy face. And I think these communities, you're specifically welcome in like whatever state you're in, and you don't have to hide it or mask it. So you can show up and you can grieve in that space. You can show up and work through anger in that space. You can show up and be blissful and happy and elated, and that's welcome. So it's just any part of us that might not normally be welcome in space or feel safe in a space is explicitly welcomed in those spaces.
Safety is the biggest, I think, and most important factor of it all, is creating that safe space for somebody to be able to work through their own stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've always hesitated to say that I'm safe or the spaces I hold are safe, because I'm like, well, that's not, safety is in the eyes of the beholder. It's like someone else may or may not feel safe, and I can't really determine that. But something I hear a lot is that people feel really safe in the spaces that I'm holding. And I think some of that might have to do with the fact that I have spent a long time working with people in the prison system, and I've learned to really specifically thinking about why someone might be like showing up with like shame or reservation or skepticism or like discomfort, really sharing their whole selves, being worried about being judged or not being accepted. So I've been really like influenced by that, and that I tend to be aware of that when people are showing up and kind of naming and acknowledging that. And I think that helps people feel like they can kind of relax and not have to be guarded in the space as much as they might normally. So safe in that sense, like I want it to be safe. I care about it being safe.
Well, it's judgment and shame-free.
Yeah. Sometimes I say it's aspirationally judgment-free, like that too, because I can't always control other people's judgment, but that's another thing I hear a lot. So maybe I'm just really being humble in some ways, but a lot of the participants who come say this feels really safe, and this does feel like a really judgment-free space.
Yeah. It sounds like it just kind of comes naturally with it, and once you open up that door, other people kind of follow along with leaning into and creating the environment as well. I mean, you have the majority of the people with that perspective. I imagine that one individual that struggles with the judgmental or the shaming aspect will feel like the oddball out. Anyways, I don't know, my brain keeps going to therapy. Therapy stuff, because there's a lot in common with that, and when I had to talk to you prior, I just thought that's so much of the same work that we do that's so aligned so well. And that's a good bit of it, is creating that space for people to just be themselves and work through their stuff and the way that they do, that they know how to do, not how I tell them how to do it. So with you, you do it through movement. Tell me a little bit more about that.
It's kind of a combination of movement and sort of somatic, like going inside oneself and really sorting through like what's my emotional state, what is going on in my body, what's going on in my mental state, and then also connection. That's a big piece of it, is that I think, and maybe it's something that's different from therapy sometimes, is that therapy, there can be group environments, but it's like vastly one-on-one work, and a lot of this is like community. It's like what happens when we're in relationship with each other, and how can we enter into that like intentional space of working through things and trying to show up with courage in something that might be kind of scary, because like therapy, like you're revealing yourself, you're maybe feel a sense of exposure, but doing that in community too is, I think, maybe something that's like a little different from therapy typically.
There's a real magical component to it. They actually say that group therapy is the most effective because of that, because you are able to build that community and teach people how to be relational. So that's fantastic in that aspect. And it reminds me of polyvagal theory, which I think that we had talked about prior, and how important that is to feel psychologically safe, per se.
Yeah. Polyvagal theory informs the work that I do on many levels, even if I'm not explicitly acknowledging that or talking about that. But I think it's really interesting how in polyvagal theory, like co-regulation is gold. And like the more people we add to that, it's like, I sometimes tell people, it's like, even in a group, like one person being really anchored and like regulated and calm and like secure in themselves can influence everyone else. And so I think adding more people, it's like the co-regulation piece. I've realized like when I'm working I do some work in the juvenile detention here in town, and that sometimes when I have the whole group and we can just like play a game where, you know, we're passing around a ball and like the whole group starts like laughing together, whereas moments before there's like, these little triangulations and in groups, and when we can get something where like the whole group is participating, I feel like they just kind of like all are supporting each other. So that's a lot of what we're doing in those spaces, is just creating something that's amplified, because there's like the more people joining in, the more there's like a sense of being, kind of, I think, in a more natural state, that we're all very like highly relational group. We're a group species.
That's the part I think that people miss the understanding of, is that we're meant to be part of a community, and how important that sense of community is, and how it's been affecting our population, especially since COVID, with the isolation, with the loneliness, with the lack of connection, and just inability to be social. So that's fantastic. And I know you had told me a little bit about your history. Are you open to telling me a little bit more about the work that you've done? Yeah,
for sure. I was thinking a little bit about it before coming to you when you sent me that question of like, who are you? I was thinking about these different things that have influenced me and are always showing up when I'm working with people now, even if I'm not doing that work currently, or those, happened a long time ago. But my first job when I got out of college was working with people getting out of prison and getting into community college. And then for really I'm still involved, but my my full-time job for over a decade was working with people in the prison system. And I was doing that first from like a more educational lens, and then working for an organization called Yoga Behind Bars that was bringing trauma-informed yoga and meditation into the prisons and jails in Washington State. And I everything that I do and that I think about and the way I hold space is influenced by that work, because it just taught me so much about belonging and what happens when we take people and we kind of tell them like they don't belong, or they're not wanted, or they're not welcome, and seeing like what that does to people versus like the opposite, when you're kind of told like, oh, the world is created for you, you belong in it, like you're good, you're credible, you're worthy. And just being able to see, I think that really taught me a lot about like trauma and the need for community, and how healing happens with community and with a sense of belonging and a sense of like that you're worthy. And then the other thing that's really influenced my work was living in India for 3 years. And when I was living there, I was working with a social enterprise fellowship program. And that also influenced me a lot to kind of like get out of the box of like just the socialization that I had growing up in the US around like the right way to think about things, the right way to do things, and to like be like, oh, there's this whole other part of the world that's like very, very different in how they think about, I mean, really everything from like love and marriage to like their entire concept of democracy is completely different. There's not like a 2-party system there. There's like 20 parties. To think like spirituality and the primary religion having many gods, and just how ritual is like so baked into society. And every single person in India, I swear, every person dances. It's like synonymous with being a human being to be a dancer. And I think that's really interesting, because that is not true in our country. Like a lot of people are like, oh, I'm not a dancer unless, you know, maybe if I'm drunk, but I'm not a dancer. So I think that's really influenced me too, living there and just seeing like this whole, it's made me realize like what was normal to be growing up here, like doesn't necessarily need to be normal. Maybe it is normal to be a dancer. Maybe we all are dancers, and we just need to have that feel really safe. So those are the things that have really influenced me. And then now I'm really like kind of trying to bring those things together. Like, okay, this work around belonging, this work around like dance and self-expression and spirituality, even if people are interested in that, but how they kind of all come together to help with healing and to help with, you know, I think similar goals to therapy.
Same goals.
Yeah.
It's all the same goals, and that's what I'm just thinking is so true on all those levels, because you have to have spirituality. It's an important component in one's healing journey, and understanding that you are a part of the world, but you are not the world, or you know, the center of the world, but really you're a part in general. And understanding that there's a lot of higher order, not understood processes out there that we can't control, and just dance in general is so, and it is funny that you said it, you know, unless drunk people become, you know, automatic break dancers or whatever. It's funny how that happens. But how when, you know, not like how held back and reserved people are about that stuff. Even myself, I'm not like, and I was the same way. I had to use something to get out of that rigidity. And now that I'm in recovery, it's like I'm so hesitant. I will not get out there and do anything like that unless there are 100 people out there and I can blend in.
Yeah. I'm really conscious of that too. Like I feel really conscious of the trauma of like most people when they were young at some point maybe stopped dancing and singing because someone told them they looked bad or they weren't doing it right, or you sensed that about yourself and compared yourself to others. And there's just like such a pressure to fit in and like not be weird or not be awkward. And there's so much like prize and there's so much like love for like athletes and people who have a lot of like fitness and can look good while doing it and perform. So if you're kind of like fumbling through it and just like it feels good, but maybe it's not like the most beautiful, elegant expression, that it's, I think it can really easily get shut down. But I think it's interesting to think about almost every human being on this earth has ancestors that engaged in dance as ritual, like going way back. I mean, all over Europe, there's traditional, we think of like Irish dancing, and even, you know, in parts of like, yeah, just in, let me think. I can't like name the dance forms, but
square dancing.
Yes, there's just
recent.
Yeah, there's just dance roots in pretty much every person, like somewhere in their lineage, they had ancestors that danced, and so I think it's in us. But I'm really aware of that. So I think at the spaces that I hold, like I purposely make it really dark, like as dark as I can get it, to where it's still safe, because I'm aware that people like want a little bit of sense of a privacy. And there's a lot of spaces in town where you're in a fishbowl if you want to dance. Like there's going to be people sitting and like drinking their drinks and watching you, and there's super bright lights. And no wonder like people then, you know, feel more comfortable if they're drinking, if they're...
Oh yeah, I would never.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be the one watching, and I'm like, you can have fun over there.
Yeah, but it's so interesting because dance, like there's so much benefit to it.
Yeah.
I think there's really interesting research that was done that over a 30-year period that Stanford initiated, where they were trying to look at what are the best interventions for age-related brain decline. So dementia, Alzheimer's, like different sort of cognitive decline. And they looked at a lot of things that we kind of like, doing crosswords and exercising. And they also looked at dance, and what they found is that exercising actually had no benefit, which was really surprising, because obviously exercise has a lot of other, you know, benefits with like cardiovascular disease and mental health, things like that. But in terms of brain-related decline, it didn't have any. I think crossword puzzles were like 14%. Reading novels was also high.
Nice.
But the highest thing of anything was improvisational dance. So not like choreographed dance, which they said is beneficial, but that's more like exercise where it's kind of like do these steps. But it's only beneficial to the point where your brain's being challenged to learn. And once people become really familiar with that, like it kind of becomes more rote. But improv dance, where you're like, you constantly are just making it up on the spot and like adjusting to gravity and to like where your body is in space. And then the more you add complexity to that by adding other people to it, where you're like responding and attuning to them, then you have even more variables that you're having to make split moment decisions about. And it's just like your brain's just like, it's just like lighting up. So I think that was really incredible, because I didn't know that when I started doing a lot of like more improvised, you know, like choreographed, non-step dancing that's just kind of free form, like just in the moment feeling what you want to do. But now I'm like, oh, cool. There's like this extra evidence that it's a good thing to do.
Well, it sounds like you kind of figured out what worked the best and what didn't, and then it was validated later. So you were seeing what helped people the most? Is that what happened, or?
I think just listening to my own body too, and being on a journey of recognizing, well, for me it kind of started, what's interesting is in a way I can draw it back to my relationship with alcohol. So when I was younger, I loved to dance, but I also was like usually going and dancing in environments where there was a lot of drinking, and I didn't have, I think what happened for me is I wasn't very much in my body, and so I couldn't easily gauge like how much a drink was affecting my physiology. So then I would kind of bypass, like my body's changing, I was having and it would go right into like, okay, now I'm just too inebriated, and it's unsafe. It's, you know, I like would quickly get to a point where I was like, yeah, just not very safe, and it was a big thing I had to work through. Like a lot of things happened for me that were just things I like that brought up a lot of shame, that brought up a lot of guilt, that I'm lucky like nothing really bad ever happened. But I kind of had this wake up where I was like, okay, this is not okay. When I was 26 years old, I completely stopped drinking. And that was kind of like the initiating moment into like trying to do more work with myself and figure out like what was going on. And a big part of that journey was like learning how to be more aware of my body's sensations and what's going on in my body. And I remember like 7 years after I stopped drinking, taking a drink of alcohol for the first time. And I'd done all this work to try to really get in my body, meditation and yoga and dancing. And I remember being like, whoa, I can feel exactly like my heart's beating a little faster and my body's getting a little warmer. And I'm like, oh, of course, if I couldn't feel those things before, then you're just gonna like keep taking the substance. And I've now learned a lot later, more recently, like how when we experience like that we don't belong or the world's not safe or we get kind of shut down and there's a lot of shame or anything like that, like we get kind of numbed out. And I recently learned our body actually produces opioids similar to morphine to shut us down, so then you can't feel what's going on in your body. So I think that's just, it's like all these things are clicking that are starting to make sense why I was so attracted to like dancing and movement as I started to realize like, oh, I really want to like get closer to me.
Yeah.
And getting closer to me means getting closer to my body.
I mean, you just described like 75% of America, I think, right there. I mean, that's all the work I do is just getting them to be able to sit with them and themselves and their feelings. I mean, in reality, absolutely. And that's not just polyvagal theory, but there's so many other modalities that's a big part of, like somatic experiencing. Not so much EMDR, but I mean, it's 70% of the work that I do. And so that's what I was just thinking as you were describing all of that. And, you know, I give the same speech about the opioids and the shutdown and being too intellectual. I will literally tell somebody, stop talking. Just stop talking and feel, no, don't tell me where you feel things in your body, point to it. And then that's where you get that entirely different shift. They'll come in super anxious and shaky and fidgety and can't sit still or crying uncontrollably, and they're so disconnected. And especially when you get into people who are, you know, out there busy every day, living their lives with constant distractions and constant things to do and in front of them, and they have to go, and they don't have that chance to get in tune with oneself, and they get so detached from one's feelings through environmental shaping as well as lifestyle. That's what happens. And when you just allow them that space to sit with it, to feel it, to tell them that it's okay for that to happen, you can, and then how to learn how to deal with it, which dances and movement is a big part of that. That's when you start to see real change happen and people becoming healthier versions of themselves. So,
I'm curious if you take a different approach with someone, given that you know about polyvagal theory and like the difference of, you know, people who are like in a activated state versus like a shut down state. Do you take a different approach when someone comes in like a really escalated state where they're like, you know, more in that kind of like upregulated versus someone who's like numbed out and kind of shut down? Do you take a different approach with them in terms of the somatic piece or like how you get them to kind of get into their bodies more?
With the shutdown, you have to get them moving. With the activated, you have to get them in tune and more attached to their bodies, because it's all coming out, it's all energy that's getting dispersed, but they don't know what's happening, and it's it's not quite clicking. And once you see that they can connect with it and that their body is doing something and that's a natural process and that it's okay, and then direct them in two ways to disperse that energy, because as one of the bases of polyvagal theory is that's energy created when we're in the fight, flight, or freeze state. It's a tremendous amount of energy that our body produces and changes our mental and physical states of being, and that energy has to go somewhere. It's also based off of the evolutionary theory of the human nervous system and how it developed in the 3 tiers as it did, and why that happens. And so there's good ways that you can get that energy out. And once you explain all of that and get them to really understand that in either way, whether it's getting them to move or just getting them to sit still for a minute and be okay with it, that's when things really start to change. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, I completely, I love that you answered it that way, because I actually feel like all the learning that I've done and observing, like not only through my kind of mental understanding and looking at research and looking at science, but just through the experience of working with so many people in so many different states, and seeing that, oh, some people like really need to learn to kind of like slow down and calm down, and it might be really helpful for them to like tune into their breath to do that. And then for some people, like that is so advanced for where their body needs, like they need to actually just mobilize and like start to move, like you said, before they kind of do the calming, like the things to calm down. They actually need to like almost escalate the body back up into that movement, into the energy. So it's really interesting. I didn't realize again, like how things click later with the understanding. So this dance space that I host, it's like we kind of follow the arc of the nervous system of someone who's really shut down, which is really interesting, because I think a lot of people are in that state. Like they've spent, maybe you're in like the agitated, escalated state of the nervous system, but if you're in that for too long, I think you kind of, like a lot of us are like COVID, and then just all the elections, just all the stuff going on that has like been so divisive and contentious in society. Like a lot of us are just exhausted.
You burn out.
Yeah, burnt out and exhausted and shut down and have to just numb out because it's like too much information. So the dance space that I host follows this arc where we start really slow, and then the music builds and gets faster and faster. So it's kind of like someone in shutdown, like slowly kind of mobilizing. Yeah. And then it reaches this peak that is kind of like a safe expression of a very activated nervous system that's like moving a lot and breathing hard and moving at a fast pace. And then the music comes down and slows down at the end. So if you follow that whole arc, a lot of people by the end have kind of gone through this like nervous system journey of like working through those states that mirror polyvagal theory and the like you said, the evolution, like the different states from shutdown to activation to to regulation. Yeah. So I think that's really, I don't know, I get kind of nerdy about that and excited about that.
Oh, I do too. Yeah, I was thinking, I was like, have you watched the polar bear video?
No. Oh, I think I've heard it referenced, but I haven't seen it.
You gotta watch the polar bear video where they shoot a polar bear with a tranq gun, and it's like some kind of 70s or 80s nature documentary. But there's other ones out there that are just like this. This is just the one that Peter Levine used in all of his teachings. But it is tranqing a polar bear from a helicopter. Actually, I showed this in my last, like 2 shows ago, and they tranq the polar bear mid-run because the helicopter is scaring the crap out of the poor bear. And so it goes down and it, is in its anesthetized state. Then the guy explains what's happening with the nervous system, and they're watching as the polar bear is coming out of being anesthetized, and how it starts shaking and releasing all of that energy from when it was in that flight state from running away. And I think that's just everything that people, need to know about polyvagal theory within a 3 to 5 minute video. And that's what happens with people is all of the shutdown and coming out of it, not understanding that the nervous system governs, you know, like 70 to 80% of our lives, that we can work through it, we can control it. And even when I was at a training with Porges, and it had dance as part of it. It's a big part of the therapies there. I still wouldn't dance. It's like I'm not that brave yet. I'm getting there.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important component that I should maybe consider as keeping, being more integral in my therapy.
Yeah, it seems like it's just like if it doesn't overwhelm us and make us shut down and disassociate, like if we can feel safe enough to do it, then I think it can be really beneficial. But I think it's important that you're noticing that about yourself. You're like, I'm not quite ready.
Yeah.
Like there's something that's maybe sensing in you that maybe you would go and you'd have to like spend a lot of time working through like the discomfort that came up that you don't have the capacity to do right now because you're really busy and you have a lot on your plate. And maybe at a time where you're like, oh, I have like more capacity to be brave and courageous and do something that might require me to like feel awkward or feel like I'm a beginner or feel like everyone's, you know, like you have to have some capacity to work through that and integrate that. And I think that's really good that you're actually like recognizing a healthy limitation for yourself.
The busyness is a poor coping skill, or what I call maladaptive coping skill. I do it to myself. So, I think we all face things when we're ready. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Just like, I just feel compassion because even though I hold this space, like I just get it. I just get why it's so daunting and scary for people. And it's so common. It's like, there's clearly really big like wounding around this. And it's interesting. I think it's really similar with singing. At the end of the dance, they've just add in like another layer of like, you know,
making people as uncomfortable
as possible.
My job, our jobs.
But I always forecast and am very transparent about what. So I actually created a thing online on my website that says what to expect, and I lay out like play by play, like minute to minute, what happens, because I think it's really important if someone is saying yes to something that is edgy for them, that they can like really know what they're saying yes to. So something that happens, and I always say this in the space too to everyone, is after all the music turns off, typically I sing a song. It's just like a minute, and it's a song with just a couple lines, and it loops. And some people will join in and sing it too. But you can just listen, you can mumble along, you can sing. And a lot of people just like find it to be really beautiful because they're just these like really simple songs, and they're slow. They're always like these really slow songs that just have simple lyrics that are kind of maybe about like rest or like letting things go. And that too, I just think it's similar that singing in one's car might be the only place that's safe, if at all, because of, again, like, am I going to sound off key? Am I going to sound good? And then that's going to make other people feel bad. Like they can go across either way. There's a teacher that I've studied with named Erin Johnson, who is in California and is part of a group called Holistic Resistance. And they lead these things called singing circles or song circles, where they get people singing. And he comes from a long line of actually Black ministers in his family that like sang and led songs in church. And he's trying to really like, you know, recognize that singing is a way that his family and his ancestors like processed grief, and you know, like that was a way for people to unite around liberation. And you know, there's deep ancestral roots there around like struggling through, even for them, like, you know, struggling in the civil rights movement, and even back to like people struggling during slavery, and like using song and dance to resist and to feel whole and to feel connected. So I don't have those exact same roots, but again, I think most human beings, if they go back in their ancestral line, like they had ancestors that sung too.
Yeah.
And so the singing is another thing. And Aaron Johnson talks about how if he goes into a kindergarten and he's like, who here is a singer? It's like all the kids are like, me, I'm a singer. And then he goes into like a third grade and he's like, who's a singer? And it will be like a couple kids are like, me. And then he goes into fifth grade and it's like crickets. And then there might be like one kid who actually sings, who's like, I'm not gonna raise my hand. Like, I don't wanna be the weirdo who sings. And that, I mean, is it really because something changed about their ability to sing or to find joy in singing? Like, no.
Social conditioning.
Yeah. It's like developing a greater sense of like, what do I have to do to fit in? And that in general, like singing is something that you only do if you're really good at it and you're going to perform it. But just to kind of sing because it brings you joy and because it's a way for you to self-express, that doesn't really matter. Yeah. So those are two things that I think are really related of like just self-expression and taking up space in a way that's not talking or smashing people, playing football. Like, you know, just...
There's days that call for it.
Yeah, it's nothing but that's like very acceptable, right?
Yeah.
But like singing and dancing, I think that is, it's just like there's different things that have been like rewarded and prized among adolescents.
I just had so many thoughts in mind. For one, you can't dissociate if you're moving. And so for severe trauma victims, that's one of the things I tell them first thing is, if you're having trouble with that, go move. Do something. Use a fidget toy, get up and walk around, go for a walk or a jog or exercise. Or if they have to sit in a group for a while, tap, color.
Yeah,
Use
knit, do something.
Yeah.
I just met with someone today who's like starting a knitting group at the university, and we were talking about just like mobilization and movement and how doing something with your hands, it's like kind of technical, is like a good way to stay in your body and to disassociate.
I just love hearing all this stuff because this is all a big part of what my personal healing journey was when I got into recovery, because I'm in because I stopped drinking alcohol 12 years ago, and knitting was how I got myself to originally sit still in a chair for an hour at meetings. And it occupies a part of your brain, that nervous, anxious part, while you can still think and pay attention at the same time. So that's fantastic. The other part that I was thinking was, with polyvagal theory, they have you sing too. And it is a social conditioning that shuts down people and makes them disown those parts of themselves. And you can see that within the development of kids, like absolutely true. And I mean, I know for me, I'm so tone deaf. I'll just think, I'll sing to embarrass my kids in the store. Whitney Houston, I will always love you, and that's it. I will never sing in front of anyone else. It'll be in the car. But it is healing because it forces you to control your breath. It is the only way that we can slow down our nervous systems and tap into that naturally, which is why yoga and meditation and breath work seems so simple, but is so effective.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of polyvagal theory exercises too that use singing as a therapeutic approach because of, for one, how we perceive it in our brains and what it and how it's processed through that. And there's a safe and sound protocol. I don't know how much of that.
Yeah, the music that's like specifically designed or engineered to access different parts of the brain, listening. Yeah. I thought of something else while you were speaking too. I was thinking about, I was going through a really hard time. So I'm actually going through a divorce and separation, and the last year of the relationship, like, just a lot of fear and panic and like this mimicking, like, a young child, like fearing a parent leaving is like this, like we form these bonds with a person. And especially during COVID and the pandemic, and we were living in Seattle at the time, and it was just like, I am a dancer and I am this person that's like in community and connected, and then being like really shut down, and having to like get all of my social needs met from just this one person. It really developed this kind of security for me in some ways too, of like, oh, my person's always there. So then during the separation, starting to like be really afraid of the loss. And I found that, interestingly, sometimes I would get so paralyzed in the fear that I actually felt like I couldn't move and I couldn't really lift my head. Like, it was just like the shutdown was so intense.
Yeah.
But I could sometimes just like start singing this little song. And it was like the most like meek little expression. But I was like, oh, wow, that's accessible, but the movement's not. So I lead these polyvagal trauma-informed facilitator trainings for people in the community, and a lot of what I'm trying to do is like what we're talking about is educate people around this, the different states of the autonomic nervous system, how they respond to stress and trauma, and then like how do we move, how do we mobilize, how do we regulate, and I'll kind of chart out to people like, here's the path of mobilization from shutdown, like little wiggles, small movements, to like bigger movements, maybe to like marching, or then getting to like fight and flight, like running or marching, or even like shadow boxing, or getting someone to like push against your hands. I even tell people like high fives are amazing. Just high five someone a few times because you're like mimicking slapping, but it's like a safe, consensual thing that you're doing. But then the other pathway is through sound. So it's like figure out which one works for you. So it starts with like little, like make little sounds, then maybe like say, I tell people like you can just think of your name and think of the first syllable of your name, and then shut your mouth and say the syllable, because it just gets people to be like,
Scream therapy is my favorite. I'll like drive my RV into the mountains and I'll just like let it out. All of it. Play heavy metal in my car and drive up and down the 93. And
that's awesome. I love that.
It is very healing. So, but that accessibility is so important, and that's how you get them out of those states. And I think that's so important to get that out there, to let people know. And I'm in a very similar position. It is frightening, and losing those attachments and those bonds, and realizing that it's just you at the end of the day, and building a new support system, a new structure, and a new life, and a new way of thinking, and a new way of doing things, and going about it is really frightening. And all of the changes in the world that have come up from COVID, I mean, all of it together, I think, has just thrown people so far for a loop that we don't know how to be anymore as people. I think we're figuring it out and getting back to it, a new normal, but it's just really hard. There's a lot of people struggling out there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. All this stuff helps so much, though. Yeah, it was really interesting because I journal pretty regularly, which is also, I think, a really good practice. And I have my journals from my last really, really difficult breakup, which was a long relationship. I lived with that person, and in my journal, I realized, like, oh, the way that I felt good was by like staying in that activated state and just staying super busy and like pushing myself and challenging myself to be like, I'm still strong, and not lean on anyone. And I was like doing all this cold plunging and like things that, it's like, okay, better that than like getting drunk and, disassociating. But I was almost like pushing myself into this like really activated state, and further reinforcing this idea of like, I can do it all on my own. And I feel like just continuing to like learn about polyvagal theory, continuing to really invest in like deepening my understanding of my body and understanding of co-regulation with others. Like this time, I feel like I've actually like moved through the pain and the grief a lot faster because I'm actually like acknowledging like, oh, actually I need to slow down and rest. I need to like call a friend. I need to not be alone right now. I need to like not push myself to like prove that I'm like tough. I need to just feel like crap and feel sad and
It's okay
get
to.
support and like maybe not be alone in that, or maybe wait like a little bit till I feel like being alone is like actually really therapeutic, because
Yeah.
I want to be close to myself in that way, but not rush that process. And I feel like it's like really shown me, oh my gosh, I really believe in all these tools and all this knowledge being supportive and helping us get through really hard things with a lot more, not just like speed, because that's not really the measure that's important. I think it's like getting through it and letting it maybe, you know, not take us off course, but like put us even deeper on our course of like, oh, this is making us stronger. This is making us like more able to hold compassion for ourselves and others. It's like deepening our awareness of the human like capacity to heal and capacity to move through things. I feel like I interrupted you. Sorry. Or you were going to say something?
Oh, no, it was just, yeah, similar too, because I relied on a lot my friends and was more open and vulnerable, whereas before I wouldn't talk about it, and I would just busy myself and get busy with everything in life and use that as a tool for distraction. And this time it's different. And I think it's because it's not as deeply excruciating. It's not as agonizing, and you do come out of it faster, or in a way that's better. I mean, there's no way to avoid these feelings. You have to move through them in some form or fashion. But it felt easier. So.
I'm so glad.
But, I was going to note too, see, your therapists aren't full of crap when they say journal or, you know. There's a reason why we do what we do and say this stuff. I just had to note that. So.
Yeah. Well, if anything, so you can go back and look at, I mean, it's nice to see like how you've changed and how you've stayed the same too, like how there's a core you that's still there, but how much we grow and change too.
Sometimes it's scary. I look back at my journal in my 20s, I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
What? So
yeah,
it is. It's really all of the stuffs, all of the little things and all the little changes. And I think it's just, at the end of the day, being okay with not being okay and learning how to get back to being okay is the big part of the process. And learning that it's okay to not be okay with people.
That part especially is compelling to me. Taking off the mask around other people and feeling safe, feeling like that's a safe thing to do, and that you won't be exploited or judged or shunned because you show what's really going on for you. But then how do we even know what's really going on for us in that piece too? Yeah, there's definitely like a scaffolding to getting in touch with and being able to actually even identify how we feel in the first place. Yeah.
Layers. Lots of layers. My brain just goes back to this stuff is so deeply embedded in trauma work, and I think the first step of that is just understanding. And when it comes to polyvagal theory, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that theoretically is also involved in that. It's not just polyvagal, but it's also the somatic experiencing. It's the evolution of the nervous system and how that came along. I think it started with Darwin. I don't remember. I have a blog about it somewhere where I deep dived into that stuff with the technicalities, but it started a long time ago and was developed over time, and how that plays into everything in our human experience, and how that derails us and sidetracks us when our nervous systems go offline and don't function normally and screw up every part of our lives, and how we come to learn how to cope and adapt to that unconsciously, you know, through the different things like avoidance, like addiction, like mental health disorders. And at the end of the day, it's the nervous system. And there's these little simple tools that you can take out, and you just have to overcome the fear of it and the shame. of connecting with others too, especially. So. Neil,
Yeah,
where are we at with time?
50 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So I wasn't keeping track. I was more talking. So I'm one of those who will drive by a place, and if I'm having a conversation, I'll completely miss the turn.
Oops,
So
we're 70 miles past our destination.
I did that last
I did
night.
that once.
Oh no. Before G Maps, and I can edit this part out, but Google Maps, I got lost for hours every day. No idea, because I could not pay attention at all for the life of me. So anyways, I think that's really important work that you're doing, and I love how you just came about it naturally. Because I'm always out there shouting and talking about polyvagal theory like a nut, and trying to bring it to all sorts of like different populations, like neurodivergent and other therapists, which I think therapists are really pretty well aware of it. But then there's the medical community and how much damage is being done within the medical, I would just say professional community in general. I say medical because I work with doctors all the time, but it's not about, making them look bad or inefficient or anything like that. It's about bringing a better awareness and understanding. I think it's for any professional that works with another person. It's really important for them to understand this stuff. Because it can be so damaging to another person. And so when you gaslight them
and damaging to ourselves, because if that other person is really dysregulated, we're so sensitive to other people's dysregulation that it's no wonder that police officers and correctional officers have like some of the highest rates of suicide and depression and like chronic illness, and like have to like not show up at work and then that costs the organization money, and they have problems with training staff, and and then they have less like qualified staff sometimes, and then it's like the people in their care like aren't met with as skillful or as people with as like much experience because of that. Like it's hard to have that retention when you have people who are getting unwell because of the work. So there's that, and I actually did some work with a dentist around this, because something I was thinking about is that we think about those professionals who maybe don't get any of this training. Like dentists are a group that doesn't get really any of this training, and yet when they're working with people in extremely anxious states. Nobody is like, yay, I'm going to the dentist to get my teeth worked on,
Right.
like unless you're just, I don't know. I almost think it's interesting to do it as like a mindfulness experiment to see like how uncomfortable can I be and still like regulate my breath. But I'm kind of weird like that. And most people like the whole time they're just pretty uncomfortable, and some people are like in full panic state, and some people don't go to the dentist because they're so afraid. And you're in this like, you're conscious, but you're in this immobilized shape where you like have to have your mouth wide open, and you're laying down, so you're in this like submissive state that very much mimics like freeze and like disempowerment and immobilization, and then you have this person like over top of you. And in general, like they're dealing all day long with people who are in really activated or shut down states. And I was explaining polyvagal theory to this dentist, and he was just like, oh my gosh, like this makes so much sense. Yeah, like I see these things happening with my patients, and I was training him in how to really like coach his patients in how they can, different things they can do and how they can advocate for themselves, and making sure, and I think some dentists do this, like, oh, you can tap me, or you can like click this button if you need to take a break, or you need me to stop. But that's kind of not the norm, I think, in most situations. And so giving people that agency, knowing that they can like take a break or they can stop, giving them options so they feel like they have some choices, because when we're in shutdown, it's like there's no solutions, there's no choices, we just disengage. So like giving people like having people like think about your preferences throughout the session keeps them kind of in that. And then also giving them some tools for like, oh, they could do a little tapping on their chest or like on their legs to kind of just stay moving, right? Like how can you move in a way that's safe and isn't gonna like disrupt whatever they're doing in your mouth? And then for maybe some people who are just like more tense, like how can they do some tense and release exercises? But if someone's just like really shut down, like he talked about how some people like can't open their mouth wide enough. And I'm like, yeah, that would make sense. If you're shut down, like you're not gonna have the tone in your around your mouth to like open your mouth really wide. And I've even noticed that in myself when I sometimes wake up first thing in the morning, I get that like existential fear of like, ooh, like life is too big and intense and hard. I want to go back to sleep. And I've noticed that in that state sometimes, like I have a really hard time like articulating in the morning or like speaking, and I feel kind of like just the reality of freeze and the muscles around your mouth, like not being online. And so I just think that's just one example that like we might not think of right away of like a group of people working with people that maybe like the law enforcement or the like prison officer is a little more obvious, but I think there's so many, like whether it's teachers or medical providers, like so many people are working with people and they're close to people and they're being affected by them. So it's also like better for them if they're aware of this and they can like for taking care of themselves, not alone, let alone like the people that they're caring for.
I just did an entire episode on that, and I was going to comment on that because the work that you're doing in the correctional system is so important, and especially with law enforcement, they don't set them up to succeed at all, and they don't make it safe for them to ask for help at all. And that's one of the biggest passions that I have, is making it okay. And I interviewed somebody who talked about the suicide and personal experience and talked about how able he was to ask for help. And I've heard hundreds of stories about how if you talk about it in those cultures, you'll be ostracized for it and your job will be affected, hands down. I mean, and it happens in military, it happens in law enforcement, it happens in the correctional system. If you look at the prison guards, not healthy, and they're traumatizing the people in the prison too, generally. I've worked with and have personal experience with that, and it is just a nasty, toxic cycle of pain and trauma at the end of the day, when just a couple little simple things like what you were just talking about with safety, creating safe environments and creating that space for people to be open and say they're struggling to work through their stuff would change the world. Sorry, all of that stuff just came up as you were talking. Okay. But you're absolutely right about that. And those professions, like I've been pushing for big time, because I see a lot of individuals who are serving in every first responder aspect, even nurses, doctors, ER people who just don't think they can get help for it. So
glad you're doing that advocacy and trying to get through to lots of different people about it.
Oh, I just kind of spent an hour on my pedestal, sorry.
No,
I'm like,
all good.
Yeah, and with the professionals like the dentist said, they don't understand what's going on, and then they react to the way that their patients are responding to them. And you get
I brought up dentists because dentists too, there's a really high suicide rate among dentists.
And veterinarians too.
Which, yeah, I mean, like, oh, are veterinarians around like extremely stressed people because their animals are hurt, right? Or they're putting their animals down. It's like, yeah, I think we have to be curious about like what's the correlation? And I do think the correlation is like when you're working with people who are, or animals even, like animals don't like being restrained. It's very scary for them. So, and we're affected by an animal, like just, I was walking here and a dog like did this really awful scream that you can just tell is like a dog being like really uncomfortable. And it just like my whole nervous system is like, and we're affected. Yeah. So if you're day in, day out working with highly stressed animals and their people, like, yeah.
It changes you unconsciously, albeit, but
That's so interesting. I didn't know that was the case with veterinarians too.
Yeah, but it does. I mean, we all give off this because we generate energy and electricity, and others pick up on it because Poor just calls that neuroception.
Yeah.
We're always looking and scanning the environment for safety or cues of danger, and whether we need to protect or defend ourselves for people who don't know really a lot about polyvagal theory. And those screams or low tone growls are what we as a species learned and how to and what to look for and cue in on, and that's why it affects our nervous system, because then it's like something's wrong, run or fight. And that's why it does that, but it changes you internally, physically, and there's no controlling it. So such interesting stuff.
Yeah, I know. It's fun to talk about it with you, because I feel like even though this is all actually just like pretty simple and pretty easy to observe, like once we learn about it, it's just like impossible not to see. Like I lead these trainings for people, and I'm like, I've learned enough over time that when I train people in this stuff, in the training, like you might be confused, you might be like, this, I don't get it, but the moment you go out and start relating with your loved ones, it's like immediately gonna click for you. And that happens every time. They're like, oh, I immediately started to see like, oh, this is happening to me. Oh, this, I'm seeing like this tone in my partner's voice or my mom on the phone with my mom, and I'm recognizing, oh, they're in an activated state or they're in a really shut down state. I'm listening and hearing like the vocal tone. I'm noticing the pace of how they're talking, and we kind of train people to like bring into conscious awareness all these things that are happening below the level of consciousness but are still affecting us. And all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, there's cues everywhere all the time. So I think it's really interesting that like in a way what we're talking about is like the most simple stuff, everyday stuff, but it's not discussed enough, like because we've been so disconnected from our bodies.
People react, and that's all we do, rather than respond, and we don't even know we have a choice to respond rather than react, and that's at the crux of it. And there's a huge resistance to learning that for people, because there's a wall of shame that comes up with thinking there's something wrong with me if I'm doing something wrong and I am not doing something right, and it all just goes together and keeps us stuck where we're at. So I think we're slowly, as a society, untangling that. It's just, we're kind of dumb in the pace. It just takes like 20 years to get those, major shifts within entire populations.
So you think therapy as a whole is that there's like more and more awareness and focus on the body? That's what you're noticing?
No.
Oh.
It should be, but it's not. The standard of therapy, the staple, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy, even dialectical behavioral therapy, all of the different types of talk therapies that, stem from first line down to third line talk therapies are the standard. And it should be body work. And I expressively talk about that all the time on my radio show, because you don't solve trauma by talking about it. Trauma's in your body. When you look at addictions, which is those two fields that I primarily specialize in, there's something under there, usually trauma, that's causing it. When you look at other types of disorders, especially through the lens of polyvagal theory, it's a inability to regulate the nervous system. So why is that? How do you fix that? It's through movement. It's not through talking about it. I mean, I can be anxious all day long and I will jabber, or I will just completely freeze up and, still talk about it. It doesn't solve it.
Yeah.
It's learning how to sit with it and work through it in a manner that works for that person. So I think it's a really good question. But I think we've reached the end of our show time, and thank you so much for joining me and coming all the way down here and taking the time out for interviewing. This stuff is so fascinating. I could talk about it forever.
Yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it.
All right, thank you. You were here on Grizzly Talk with me, Megan McKay, and JP. Did you say your last name, or do you want to say it? Or
Yeah, JP Frank.
Okay, JP Frank is part of our beautiful Missoula community here, and thank you so much. Have a good Wednesday.